Okay, welcome everybody to this special event of our DigiGEF 21, the digital conference here of the GEF, which is the Gesellschaft für empirische Bildungsforschung, the Society for Empirical Educational Research. And my name is Mareike Kumpler. I'm from the DIP Leibniz Institute for Research and Information on Education. And I welcome you on behalf of the organization team and also the GEF Executive Board. For those who don't know it, the GEF, the Gesellschaft für empirische Bildungsforschung, is an interdisciplinary society with members from various disciplines, from psychology, educational research, subject matter teaching, economy, sociology, and what we're all interested in is empirical research in the field of education. And we're the largest scientific association in this domain in Germany. And usually the GEF comes together in an annual conference. And for the year 21, we have decided to host a special year, a conference here with very different offers all along the year 21. And we're almost at the end of the year 21. And it's my special delight to have our last keynote of our keynote series at the GEF. Presented today. And our distinguished guest speaker is Professor Courtney Bell, the director of the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research and professor of the Learning Sciences at the University of Wisconsin. And my co-host, Eckhard Kleve, also from the DIP, will introduce Courtney Bell in a moment. Before we start, let me give you some organizational information. And you're watching this keynote on the GEF YouTube channel. And this is a live stream, and it is open to a broad audience. And it is also recorded and will be available, but also to the participants of the DigiGEF conference here. So yes, and after the talk of Courtney Bell, there will be a question and answer session. And you can ask your questions either by using the chat function at the YouTube channel, but this means you need to be logged in with a YouTube account or a Google account. If you don't have that, or if you don't want that, you can also write an email to the email address, which is also posted in the YouTube channel, and we will take care of your question then. And I will read out the questions here in our session. Yes, and you can write in English or German, just as you like. So that is all for the organizational part, and I would like to hand over to Eckhard Kleve, who will introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Mareike. It is a special pleasure and honor for me to introduce Courtney Bell to you. Courtney Bell, as Mareike already said, is a professor of learning sciences at the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. This university is one of the few public universities in the US that rank very high as a research university. So it is public and it is one of the best reputed research universities in the US. And part of that research agenda in Madison is educational research, which is organized by an interfaculty center called the Wisconsin Center of Educational Research, founded in 1964, which Courtney directs. She's been moving to that place last year in the midst of the pandemic, which I think must have been a very, very tough start for a director. And she's now directing this institution, and she has been leading it through 1.5 years of pandemic, but obviously, to my knowledge, very successful. This center is, just to let you know the background of her work, this center often reminds me of our Leibniz Institutes, because it is a combination of basic research and applied research. It is interdisciplinary in nature, and it is built on a close collaboration between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. The difference, of course, is that it's not a separate institution, but it is part of the structure of the University of Wisconsin, and it includes like 65 faculty members from all faculties, including School of Education, Psychology, etc., etc. So I think this is a very demanding place to work, but also very interesting and nourishing, because there's so much ideas around and so much disciplines collaborating. And it is also, as far as I know, a personal goal for Courtney to link teaching, policy, and research. And that's why I think that position is a perfect position to her. I met Courtney when she was at ETS, before she moved to Wisconsin. She's been serving at ETS for like 12 years as a researcher. She was one of the founders of a larger project called Understanding the Quality of Teaching at ETS. She was working on teacher certification testing with very innovative kinds of assessments, which never have been, unfortunately, sold very largely because they were too expensive, too complicated, but they were the best test possible to test for professional competence of teachers. And last but not least, she was the principal investigator for ETS in the Thales video study, where the DIP participated, also Rent collaborated, and that's where we met. And that was a great experience for me. We had a lot of discussions, for example, on what we measured in that study was teaching practice or teaching quality, or whether the operationalization of teaching constructs would qualify as assessment or just as measurement. So these were the very basic questions we discussed, and I think these are also at the heart of what Courtney will talk about today. And I have a very high esteem. I knew her and I know her as a very friendly and very, very competent colleague. And you will all know that she's the editor, the co-editor of the recent edition of the Handbook for Research and Teaching. And she has a lot of publications on teaching quality, especially on developing protocols, validating observation protocols, etc. And just to finish this introduction, it is interesting to know that Courtney, before she came to ETS, she was working on a wide variety of topics in educational research. She is a teacher herself. She has taught as a high school chemistry, physics teacher for several years. And then she moved to Michigan State University, where she had a fellowship from Spencer Foundation. And she was working on diverse topics like teaching, of course, in the group led by Deborah Ball, but she was also working on policy issues, and her dissertation actually was on parental choice. So she has a very broad background, and I think she would be the best person to represent what we in our organization, our GEF, are aiming at, namely the combination of basic research, policy-oriented research, practice-oriented research in order to support education. Thank you very much, Courtney, to being with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Eckart. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here, and Marika, thank you very much for inviting me. I am going to hope that the technology behaves itself and we are able, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up, we'll take that. Excellent. So I am delighted to talk with you today about some very high level ideas that have been percolating over many years, and we will have time today to discuss how you make sense of these, what questions you may have, how this fits and does not fit in whatever your country context may be. I presume much of it is Germany, but it might be other countries and contexts as well. So we know, and Eckhart and Marijke both alluded to it in their comments, that universities and the research enterprise more broadly have many capabilities, right? One of the most valuable is for us to be able to create new knowledge that can improve the human condition. And in our case, as people who are focused on education, improve public education. In most countries, especially in the United States, it's the case that researchers that systematically study schools and the policymakers that regulate schools are largely disconnected from one another. And both are disconnected from the daily happenings amongst teachers, students, and subject matter that occurs in K-12 classrooms. And this disconnect shown here with the picture between researchers and practitioners was recently summarized by a US journalist. She wrote here, researchers often complain that teachers don't use their insight and discoveries in the classroom. Teachers often complain that researchers aren't solving their problems or answering their questions about how to best teach. And what this means is that it leaves a gap for students with very little evidence-based instruction in their classrooms. I hope this is less case in Germany, but this is for sure the case in the United States. So this disconnect and this lack of shared understanding is not a new critique in education or elsewhere in the social sciences. Scholars have been working on this issue with diverse approaches and different approaches. Some on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see, have been working on how we can use research in the policy environment to improve the lives of children. Others have been creating and studying research practice partnerships as a model designed to address common research questions. And others have scanned the literature to find and document high impact cross-sector collaborations that are changing the world. Most of us in this kind of virtual room are researchers, and so our lives are filled up at the top picture there with teaching and writing and studying about those two contexts shown by the bottom pictures. In fact, very few of us will ever become policymakers, and still fewer will go back perhaps to be a K-12 teacher or lead a school. So a question for us is then, how can we as researchers be a part of improving education and still contribute to the foundational or basic understanding about how teachers and students learn and develop? How can we achieve both of these important goals? So today, my aim is to talk with you a little bit about how we can think about that as researchers. I'm hoping to illustrate how decisions about study goals, definitions of teaching quality, and measurement modes pose trade-offs to us as researchers. And I'd also like to show how those trade-offs shape what the field learns about teaching quality. I'll be using teaching quality as a case, but you can think of the role of goals and definitions of constructs and measurement modes for any construct or domain. So I encourage you to think about this through your own area of expertise. I should, though, say a word about what I mean when I say assessment. I know there's lots of meaning that's sort of lost in translation. I don't mean a test of teaching, although of course we do give teachers multiple choice tests. We assess teaching in many different ways. And so I'm using this word assessment in a very broad way. And it is not necessarily tied to any types of consequences. So we assess it through questionnaires, portfolios, through simulation, which I'll say more about. We use artifacts, or which might be lesson plans or the materials students are using in their classrooms. And certainly around the globe, by video and in person, we observe teaching. So today I'm going to be drawing on data from studies that use questionnaires, artifacts, and observations to show how our research choices are really about trade-offs that have implications both for the improvement of teaching and for what the field learns about teaching. The studies that I'll be drawing on today are 4, and they're listed there for you. The first one, the Understanding Consequential Assessment Systems for Teachers, or UCAST, occurred in Los Angeles, which is one of our largest school districts in the United States. And it had participants in the study that were both administrators and teachers, just over 300 administrators and about 5,500 teachers. The second study, the VOICE study, is a study of special education teachers. So those are teachers who are principally charged with supporting students with special learning needs. The third study is the Global Teaching Insight Studies. Alternatively, we call it, you'll hear me call it both things, the TALIS video study. That study took place in 8 economies around the globe, more than, or roughly 700 teachers and differing numbers of students. In that study, we were working with observations, artifacts, questionnaires, and student achievement tests. And then finally, I'll touch very briefly in my comments on the Understanding Teaching Quality study, which was funded by the Gates Foundation. That takes place in a single large state in the United States, and it used observations, artifacts, and value-added measures. The talk is divided into 3 parts. First, I'm going to describe how the goals that we have in mind as researchers shape what it is we learn and as a field and how we can impact the improvement of teaching. I'll take turns and turn then to definitions of teaching quality and the modes that we use in order to achieve our goals. And then finally, we'll turn to a conversation or discussion about questions and answers. So I'm very curious. I don't know that I'm going to be able to see it in the way the technology is set up, but I'm very curious to know how many of you in this virtual room have ever developed what I'll just call an assessment tool. So a survey, a set of scales, a math assessment, an observation system. Marika, is there a way for us to know? Yes, we have a thumbs up. We have 1 thumbs up. Okay, well, I will presume, given the givens, that many of you have done this. And for those of you who have done this, you know firsthand the truth of this sentence that I'm putting up. Assessment tools are created with a purpose in mind. We do not just invent them for no reason. We want to use them, and we have a way that we want to use them. Modern validity theory, folks like Michael Caine and others have really emphasized that this use of an assessment score is what it is we need to be focused on when we're developing those assessments. Now, the truth is, we also know that we have multiple purposes in mind, and sometimes we would like to use an assessment tool that was created for one purpose, and now we need to put it to another purpose. An example of this is the TALIS questionnaires that you all are so familiar with at DIF for sure. We want those questionnaire responses often to provide comparisons across countries, or at least the OECD would like that. And we also hope that those same questionnaire items and scales can provide feedback, perhaps to schools within a country. So we're very familiar with this multiple goals situation. But we also know, especially those of us who have developed them, that assessments are very limited. Broadly speaking, thus the eyeglasses there, the lenses through which we look at classrooms, broadly speaking, we use assessments to look into classrooms to accomplish the goals that we have, whether that's improving teaching or sorting teachers or understanding the relationships through regression analyses. So when we give students, for example, surveys about their teachers, or when we observe teachers interacting with those students, those folks are engaged in a human activity, and we, by assessing them, are also engaged in a human activity, like playing football or traveling or making decisions. Those are human activities. Assessment is a human activity. And like any human activity, there are knowledge, skills, capabilities, beliefs, norms associated, right? You can tell I come from a sociocognitive perspective here. So we are always layering our assessment activity onto the real world activity, in our case, teaching and learning, in order to understand something and accomplish some goal. So the good and the bad news is we're using our assessment to understand those real world activities. But our assessment activities are going to be limited. I'll give you an example that, at least for me, makes an awful lot of sense about the limitations of assessment. So imagine for a moment we want to understand the nature of friendship. So friendships are a really complex set of beliefs, feelings, knowledge, actions in the world, and they happen in the real world, right? And so we can watch a movie and we can learn something about friendship. We can read a novel, we can read or write a poem, we can use a psychological theory to understand friendship. We can do MRIs of people's brains when they're engaged with talking to their friends or people that they love, and we can look at what parts of the brains light up. All of those activities allow us to understand friendship in some kind of a way, but they're not friendship, and they're all limited in some way. And assessment is exactly like this. Our assessments of teaching and learning that we use to understand classrooms are exactly like this. And I point this out because this is at the root of the tensions and trade-offs that we face when we're determining how best to assess teaching for a particular purpose. Here is a very clear example of this kind of issue of how we layer an assessment, in this case, standardized observations of teaching, onto the daily work or the daily interactions of teaching. So on the left there, in the United States at least, underneath daily classroom teaching, those are the kinds of activities that a teacher would engage in. Planning the unit with the curriculum in front of the teacher, planning specific lessons, teaching, reflecting, maybe quietly to him or herself with colleagues, and then addressing the problems over time that they notice, right? So in the UCAS study, which I'll turn to in a moment, which is the study in Los Angeles, there was a standardized observation assessment practice. It was the Danielson framework for teaching, and it came with a whole bunch of activities. And you can see those activities listed there for you. You'll notice that the Black activities don't exactly overlap between the daily teaching and the standardized observation practice, and the red ones are where there are overlap. So there are italics there where you see reflect on the lesson under daily teaching. And part of the reason I put that in italics is because those don't map exactly. In the standardized observation practice of the teacher, when the observers were using the observation tool, they gave the teachers actually written and numerical ratings of feedback. And that's a different act than Courtney standing by herself or thinking over what went well in that lesson. It's also different to then have a conversation to discuss the ratings and develop an improvement plan. When we look at this idea of our assessment activities overlapping daily, the activities we want to understand in the world, we can see in this example, roughly 3 of these overlaps shown in red there. And that reflection one I've already suggested is maybe a partial overlap. So this overlap in the middle helps us remember our assessment activities are limited in what they're going to be able to help us think through and understand. If we think about this in traditional assessment terms, we would say it's something like that our assessment activity has specific content coverage shortcomings in this case, and it introduces through those other tasks that are a part of the observation framework what may be construct irrelevant variation in our assessment of teaching. Okay, so all of this is to say we enter into research with our human selves with amazing but limited assessments, and we want to achieve some goals. So let's turn now to those goals, and I'm going to focus on one that is very common that as researchers we often care a great deal about, and at least in the US we get asked about a lot. We really would like to know how to give feedback to teachers or to schools and school districts. So we need to get very clear about what we mean by feedback, though. So if we really hope to improve the quality of interactions in schools, when we assess teaching, we are always engaged in what I'll call a feedback loop here. We can specify feedback loops at a very high level. There's some examples there for you. So let's stick with the teacher for right now. A teacher is always going to have a goal, right? Human behavior is goal-driven in some sense. And so a teacher has a certain goal, and she receives information that's relevant to that goal. That could be, if they're a student teacher, a numerical rating. It could be a mentor providing some feedback about what the student teacher is doing. That information has a specific level of detail. Maybe it's numbers, maybe it's text, etc. That information is going to be received or maybe gathered by the teacher on some time frame. So maybe it's after every lesson or twice a year or something like that. And the teacher uses the information in the context of other information that she has about that's relevant to the achievement of that goal. I'll say more about that last one in a moment. So feedback also, though, is given to individuals with different roles. So that was our teacher. And here is an example where we have a school district wanting to use our scores, let's say, from that observation tool, which was the case in the UCAS study. So a researcher or a district official sitting in that building at the top might get information from that same observation tool about all of those teachers and use that information in order to make various kinds of decisions. So it's worth pointing out that this type of feedback that we as researchers are often asked to provide is at this aggregated school level or Länder level in the case of Germany, or state level here in the case of the US. So what is this feedback loop? Said very, very broadly, it's all of those things, information, it comes with a level of detail, a time frame, people use it to achieve a certain goal, and they combine it with information. And it's also true that the role you have is going to shape the feedback loop that's relevant to you, and what information, et cetera, all those things in red, you really are going to be focused on. So let's take a look quickly at an individual teacher's feedback loop. You've already seen the right-hand side of that slide. Those are the tasks that we used in Los Angeles when we were working with teachers, or when the district was working with teachers in this standardized observation. Let's pull it apart and think about it as a feedback loop now, though. So it turns out that the goal for the individual teachers in that study was to provide teachers with annual feedback. It happened that they were observed twice in a given school year. And the goal was to provide information to the teacher that would identify the particular areas of their teaching practice that needed improvement. They did this with Danielson's framework, which has 4 domains and a number of dimensions underneath that. So they got both domain and dimension scores, and administrators were required to type copious notes about what they observed during the lessons. And they also made judgments about those notes, and they shared those judgments, right? About this was good, this was not so good, et cetera, like that. And here's how it related to what I saw last time. That's what I mean by commentary. It's true, though, that all of those individual teachers were combining that information from the observation tool and the process around the tool with, for example, the scores they got last year, information about their beliefs, about their own competencies, or beliefs about the administrator's reputation as an observer. Was I being observed by somebody who's a good observer, an accurate observer, or someone who is less so? You get the idea. At the district feedback level, the feedback loop that the district was interested in was different. So their role was to first train and certify administrators on the observation tool. So they were very focused on that. Over time, they were reviewing the total scores, not those domain scores, not how did someone do on instruction, or how did someone do in the environment, or how was their planning. They were looking at aggregated total scores, because it was those aggregated total scores around which the overall judgments about teachers had to be made. So they would also look at the quality of the ratings. Were there enough? They wouldn't look at the kinds of quality issues that we would as researchers, as an aside. And then they would discuss the teacher, the school ratings, what area of the city this took place in. And over multiple years, the district was using those scores from the observation tools to essentially improve the composition of the workforce in their district. So laying that out in the same way we laid out for the feedback loop, they were trying to identify the lowest performance and improve the workforce. They looked at those total scores roughly 2 to 4 times a year. And why 2 to 4 times a year? Because that's how they had to monitor it according to the union contract. So they were really focused, for example, on the number of teachers that had what were called actionable scores. And by that, I mean teachers who had low enough scores that according to the contract, were going to have certain things, conversations, certain improvement efforts made on their behalf and with them in order to adhere to the rules of the contract, the teaching contract. So of course, though, the district was combining all of this information that they were getting with whether or not this administrator was certified. You can imagine what the conversations were like in the district office that we witnessed when they knew that they were getting, for example, low scores from an administrator in a school building where that administrator had not yet passed the certification test. So they were always combining this information with other information. Let's look at these now side by side to make the point. And the point here in this slide is that these feedback loops are looking at different information on different timeframes for different people. And that information from the very same assessment is being combined with different information that makes the assessment information meaningful. And so where we're just thinking as researchers, we have a single purpose, we actually, in this case, when we're working with a district, we have multiple feedback loops that are present here that are relevant. And that's a complexity that gives us some trade-offs to think about. It gives the district some trade-offs if they're the people inventing the observation system or implementing the observation system, but certainly if we're the researchers implementing it, it gives us some things to think about. So I've listed here for us some trade-offs. And still sticking with feedback, but those two feedback loops we have now. So the choice, for example, about whether to use an observation tool that has a definition of teaching that is specific to the subject versus general to the subject is a choice that had to be made and has to be made in our studies. The choice of how many observers. Is it just a single observer? Is it an observer that has a supervisory relationship to the teacher? And finally, there's also questions about sort of the methods that it's done with, the length of the lesson, the frequency of the observation. So if we look at observers, we're just going to take one of these trade-offs as a case in point. This shapes who is involved in our assessment. The district happened to make the decision that it was going to be a single observer. That might be very useful when a teacher is trying to improve because that supervisor, that administrator is in that teacher's building, knows the students, knows the particular class, the context, the geographic context, the parents, the curriculum, etc. Maybe that makes it very possible for that principal to give the teacher feedback that helps the teacher grow. Maybe not. We can imagine cases where that's not true. But from a district level, the trade-off there is that we're maximizing any potential bias that might exist in that administrator, good bias or not so good bias. We have a single observer score, so that raises some issues about accuracy, and certainly it raises issues about the precision of our scores or the measurement error associated with it. I won't go through all of these in the interest of time, but I give the observer one as an example to say that everything from the definition to who is involved in the assessment to the methods that we use in the assessment offer us these trade-offs that we as researchers sometimes unconsciously are making decisions about. So these trade-offs are implicit, and they're going to always shape what it is we can learn from the study and what the field can learn over time. And it's to that I'll now turn. So let's consider for a moment what we can learn from these kinds of studies. So first, we have learned from these exact kinds of studies, this study and others, that there are systematic differences across grade levels of students. We've been able to learn that because we've been using single observation definitions that are operationalized in general observation tools. One question, though, an implication for the field is, what do we know about the improvement rate of teaching? If teachers learn at a certain rate, which we're documenting now in another study, if teachers learn at a certain rate using general observation tools, might they improve their practices more rapidly with subject-specific feedback? It's a question. We also have learned that administrators are not very accurate in the use of their scoring scales, but they are, the scores that administrators assign do reflect what other assessments, in particular value-added measures, show us about the rank ordering of teachers. So one question that this kind of thing raises is, even though administrators are not accurate, if they are not accurate, would teachers improve again more rapidly if they had someone like a subject matter specialist using that general tool, giving them feedback? So would we be able to maximize things a little bit more? That's another kind of implication of that results from the fact that administrators right now are the people doing the work. Another kind of learning that we have is scale reliability varies by what is rated. So we know classroom management in the US tends to be easier to rate. We also know about the number of observations that are necessary for different types of scales inside of the classroom for us to be able to get reliable measures. So that's been the standard, and we can continue to evolve that standard. But we could do things differently. What if we did shorter, more frequent observations of teachers? Would they be able to improve in a different way than they currently have? So I share those kinds of ideas with you, and we'll now turn to definitions to say this. It matters a great deal what our purposes are and the trade-offs that those purposes are related to. So I'm going to turn at this point to the definitions of teaching quality to further this idea. And I'm going to use an example from the study of special education teachers to help us. You may be aware that in the United States, we have a large number of students that have learning disabilities of various types. And we also have a federal law called IDEA. It's listed out there for you. And I'm summarizing here what the law says. The law requires teachers in the United States and school districts to ensure that students that have a disability are provided with a free, appropriate public education that's tailored to their individual needs in what we call the LRE, or the least restrictive environment possible. And this is the idea that everyone can have access to a good education. So in the VOICE study, this is where we were working with more than 60 special education teachers in Rhode Island, which is a relatively small state just north of New York on the eastern seaboard. We did a study where we had two different definitions of teaching quality in mind. And I'd like to share those findings with you now and show how they had certain kinds of trade-offs and implications for the field. So the first, again, was Charlotte Danielson's framework. This framework and its observational rubrics that go with it were used by Rhode Island for all the teachers in the state to define good teaching. And when you read the book-length work of what the framework for teaching is, it describes on the left there a constructivist approach to teaching that really values student autonomy and initiative. It supports the development of critical thinking and making applications of critical thinking from one context to another among students. So the role for teachers in the framework's view of good teaching is for teachers to facilitate, to prompt conversations and experiences that help students construct their own representations. That gets operationalized in the rubrics that we call FFT, or the framework. And what you see there on the right-hand side is the instructional domain. There's 5 main dimensions, or what they call components, and they're listed there for you. So we were using Danielson's framework. We were also using a second definition of teaching quality, which is a view of instruction advanced by Michael Presley and his colleagues in 2003. And this is around this idea that good, high quality teaching for students with special needs to reduce the cognitive load for students. And the idea here is that we need to decrease the cognitive load so that teaching practices are not overburdening students' working memory. And this decreased cognitive load facilitates productive interactions between long-term and working memory. And by reducing the burden on working memory, then knowledge can be encoded in long-term memory, where it can then be applied and transferred and generalized to other more complex problems. And so this approach is particularly important with students with what we call high incidence learning disabilities. So the view of the teacher and the teacher's role in this kind of view of high quality teaching is that teachers should then be using very intensive, very explicit, systematic, individualized instruction. So we used a tool, the Quality of Classroom Instruction, or the QCI, that was developed by our colleague Chris Dobler and his colleagues at the University of Oregon. So the QCI has 8 principles here, and they are rated on a 3-point scale: low, middle, and high, with video exemplars and those kinds of things. You can see, though, and now I'll show you the 2 definitions of teaching quality compared side by side, there are some areas of overlap. Number 7 does not overlap with FFT in this particular domain. I'm only showing you here the instruction domain for the general education definition, which is embodied in FFT. Let's dig in, though, a little bit so that you can see what's inside of these components for FFT, because you're seeing everything that's there for QCI, but it's not visible here. So let me take a moment and let's take a look at what's inside of assessment and instruction. So assessment is used in a sophisticated manner. It involves students establishing the assessment criteria. Students use self-assessment. They monitor their progress as teachers also monitor their progress, and teachers provide high quality feedback to students from a variety of sources, right? We have different kinds of feedback coming to students. Formative assessment is used, and students are aware of how their work is going to be judged summatively. In another one, engaging students in learning, students are highly intellectually engaged, they make important material contributions, and the lesson should be adapted in this view to the needs of individual students in the classroom. And technology here plays an important role in supporting students to understand complex subject matter. So let's imagine for a second that we're using the tool that the state was using, which is Danielson, and we're using that to observe a lesson. So let's imagine we're having this feedback conversation with this individual teacher. It's likely that we're going to be focused on the things there in the bullets, right? So we'll be talking with the teacher about what kinds of ways the teacher was assessing, what were the students self-assessing, how were they doing it? We might discuss what feedback the teacher gave to the students. We would certainly discuss whether or not the teacher was using formative feedback and what kinds of practices, and then whether or not the students knew the summative assessment criteria. If we were using the QCI, which is more tightly tied to the definition of special ed teaching quality, we would be looking for intensive, explicit, systematic, individualized instruction. And around assessment, we would be discussing with the teacher the timeliness of the checks that he or she was engaged with the students. And we would certainly be talking about how did the teacher know what the students understood from the instruction. So it's clear, right, that these are very different kinds of conversations. And I suspect, though I don't have empirical evidence, we're not doing that work right now, that if we were to have conversations repeatedly within each of these definitions of teaching over and over, teachers would learn different things over time. We have a new paper out where we carried out a content analysis of these two tools, and we found that many components in FFT did not, in fact, map to the view of high quality teaching that is embedded in the special education community. Now, when we looked at the distribution of scores in this study, here you can see the two domains on Danielson's framework. Domain 2 is the environment scale, and domain 3 is the instruction scale that I've been showing with you. We can see that amongst these more than 60 special education teachers, on average, instruction is 0.6 lower on a scale of 1 to 4 than environment. To give you some kind of context for that, first I should say the standard deviations for instruction is about 0.2, and for environment, is 0.3 and 0.2 respectively. So a comparison to the Understanding Teaching Quality Center, which is a similar age group of students, also where we use Danielson, also scores were created by researchers, not by principals. The means here were 0.2, 2.2, and 2.5 respectively. So I got curious when I was working on this talk, this difference between instruction and environment, where we see these special education teachers being rated lower on Danielson, is actually quite outside of the norm. So I looked across 3 different data sets, and in general, the difference, even though the means vary across studies, in general, the difference between those two domains using Danielson in 4 data sets now is about 0.3. And so we see more than double that here. So these special education teachers are being assigned lower scores. And you can see here, the general education scores are on the left and the special education scores are here on the right. And you can see it's largely driven by the use of assessment, the questioning and discussion techniques, and engaging how special ed teachers are engaging students in learning. So imagine that you are an official, maybe you're a research official in the state of Rhode Island, and you have a trade-off to consider. Let's say you're interested in using these observation scores for feedback, as we were supposing. So here's a question for you. Should you be using a definition that reflects high quality special education instruction with this particular subgroup of teachers, or should you be using a tool that has a view of teaching and learning that is for all children? Now, before you answer that in your minds, we have to consider the trade-offs that come for providing feedback to an individual. I've only talked about the trade-offs for an individual teacher. If you're a researcher, let's say, working for a different purpose, similar to what we were talking about previously around the district office using those observation tools to see things about the whole population of teachers, you might want to know some additional details. So let me tell you the results of a comparison that's relevant for that researcher. And I'll tell you, this is what you know. For the feedback, I'll tell you that main finding right away. So despite these differences that we see in the means, and actually in the variation, it turns out that when we use those two different observation definitions of good teaching, we rank order teachers similarly. Let me show you. So what economists often do in the US is take a distribution, let's take the left-hand side, the FFT distribution in the instruction domain only, and they divide it into quintiles. So there should be a 20% of the distribution in each of those 5 quintiles. You do the same thing on the other tool, the special ed tool, and you then see to what degree was someone in the lowest quintile on the general, with the general definition, also scored low in the lowest quintile on the special ed definition. And you want there to be the gravity, the most overlap should occur on the diagonal I have there in gold. And you can see, we see this for the most part. There are some exceptions, but take a look, for example, under FFT, let's read across in the 4th quintile. We can see there that teachers, classrooms that had instruction that was rated in the 4th quintile, whereas 5% were rated in the 4th and another 5% in the 5th quintile on the QCI, so roughly 10%. The goal here is to keep the off diagonals quiet. So we do in general see some similar rank ordering here. This means that for the researcher that wants to use those FFT scores, certain kinds of analyses might be acceptable. So for one purpose, feedback, perhaps we're quite concerned. I can tell you, we as researchers were very concerned about the definition of teaching quality and how well it mapped to the special ed definition of teaching quality. But for certain other research purposes, we were less concerned. So these, of course, are not all the issues the person in Rhode Island needs to take account of. But they are some of them. We could go on and think about all the many trade-offs and things that that person would need to take account of. But here, the main point that I'd like you to focus on here is that the definition of teaching quality can lead both to expected and predictable outcomes and what we took to be a very unexpected outcome. We did not expect those tools to rank order teachers similarly. So when we use these different definitions, we can learn certain kinds of things. And that's one of the implications for the field. We've learned important things using different definitions of teaching. We've learned that the differences may matter, but we've also learned that rank ordering, and we see this in the MET study, which is another large study that compares tools, that the rank ordering is roughly similar. But there's still so much that we can learn, and what the way we do our work now has implications for the kinds of questions we can ask. So one question that immediately comes up is, in what ways do these definitional differences shape other valued outcomes? So for example, teacher self-efficacy, their job satisfaction. If we're using a special ed tool, do we see some differences in things we haven't been looking at before? And so then that makes a different case for why we would want to use a certain tool or another kind of a tool. So let's turn now to this third and final aspect of our work that provides us with trade-offs and shapes what we can learn as a field. Here I'm going to draw on the TALIS video study, or the Global Teaching Insight study, which is the design of the study is a longitudinal pre-post design in which we use multiple types of assessment to understand the relationships between teaching and learning across these 8 economies. And perhaps most importantly, and of interest and discussion for this group, we're using very highly standardized, hope we're going to be able to discuss. This occurs in quadratic equations, I should say. So in the study, we assessed teaching and learning in multiple ways. We used questionnaires, artifacts, and those artifacts, or the lesson materials, were assignments. We used the quizzes that got given to students. If teachers gave us their PowerPoint slides, we took those as well. So all that refers to artifacts. And then we also use multiple choice tests of students learning across that pre-post design over the unit of instruction. And we did video-based observations of teaching. Now, in addition to those multiple assessments of teaching, we also had what I would call multiple modes. So each of those modes I just rattled off for you have different kinds of affordances and constraints. So, for example, we know that questionnaires are relatively simple to administer, but we know there's a long history of validity challenges such as social desirability. Of course, there are validity challenges with all the modes. Now, you all also are really aware that often as researchers, we're lucky. We just lucky enough to choose one mode, maybe two, to carry out our studies. So what this study offers us is the ability to kind of learn from a single study population, a single group of teachers and students, the same group, how these multiple modes can help us understand what we can learn and what those trade-offs are. So this was one of the TALS video study's main goals, and so we have that opportunity to learn that here. So I'm excited to share this with you from that vantage point. So what do we really mean by the word mode? So within each of these types of measurement modes, there is an implied vantage point or a perspective. So a teacher participant, a student participant, a third-party rater. These are not better or worse than one another. They are just simply different vantage points, and modes offer that. Modes also work through particular kinds of mediums. So, for example, a pencil and paper questionnaire is associated, in our case, in this study, with perceptions. People are reporting on their perceptions. The artifacts are carried out by those third-party raters using rubrics or criterion-based judgments. You get the point. And with these different modes, we can assess or understand different aspects of classroom interactions. Not every mode is going to be able to look at every aspect of classroom practice. So there's considerable complexity here in this issue about mode. And a critical point that the study ultimately teaches us is this idea that there are affordances and constraints with every mode. There really is not a one best. But to the degree we could figure out a one best, we have to be thinking about our purpose here. So I'm going to share with you a little bit to demonstrate this with 3 different modes. I'm going to focus on the post-student questionnaires, the video domains, and the lesson materials. I'll use those words interchangeably with the word artifacts. These are the 6 domains that we observed for using the video tools. And today I'll share similarities and differences across 6 student post-unit questionnaire scales. And those map onto 5 of those video domains and 4 of these artifact or lesson materials. So the technical report has all of the details about how this was done. It's quite complicated for each one. So I'm going to have to direct you there. The technical report is online. At a high level, we're going to look at how students' perceptions on third-party observers' views and third-party raters of these lesson materials compare on those 3 aspects of teaching. And we will also look at how the student questionnaires and the third-party observers compare on social emotional support and classroom management. So at the top, you're going to notice that we don't actually consider the formative assessment domain, which is listed up there for you under videos. Those analyses are underway, and there's not a super tight mapping across these. You'll also note that the lesson materials are not aligned with social emotional support and classroom management. That's actually that point that I mentioned before, that not every mode is able to assess every aspect of classroom. So let's turn right away to the questionnaire data. So these are the distributions of the class means on 6 of the questionnaire scales in each country as reported by students at the end of the quadratic equations unit. They're plotted above and below the line, so violin plots. Now, a reminder, these are classroom means that are inside of these distributions. So these distributions are showing us the variation across classrooms. And across countries rather, there's roughly speaking 80 classrooms in each of these distributions. That's not quite true, but roughly speaking, it's a way to understand it. So let's simplify this a little bit and look at just a single country. So let's take a look at Chile, and we can notice 3 things here. First, if we look at all 6 of those scales, cognitive activation, teacher support for learning, I won't read them all to you, those 6 scales down the left, we see that the means, which are shown with the black dots, vary. So we can see they're using the scale. And second, across all the practices, most of the 4-point scale is used. Now that is different by different scales. So you can see cognitive activation shows less variation than, say, disruption does. So it turns out that those three insights hold for questionnaires across all the countries. So let me go back to that. Now, there's an interesting exception to this. Take a look at Shanghai. Students there see different teaching practices quite similarly. So we see first those means are shifted somewhat to the right, and there is less classroom to classroom variation. So we see more bunched up distributions on certain of those practices. If we look across all the countries, we can see that average classroom students reports lower means are shown on cognitive activation, which is in red, and there's relatively larger variation across classrooms in disruptions. So that's the last scale there. So we're going to come back to that pattern of cognitive activation being more condensed around certain score points and disruptions having more variation across classrooms. Let's turn though to the videos. So here we see the video scores, and again, we're looking at the classroom mean scores. The means are created by averaging across raters. Everything was double rated, segments and lessons. And if we look at within a country at the same things we did for questionnaires, we notice that the classroom means vary by the teaching practice or domain. You see they vary quite a bit there. We see at some point across all the scales, we're using those 4-point scales, but within a domain, there can be very little variation across classroom. Let's look more deeply at this comparison now between videos and questionnaires so we can think about mode. On the right-hand side, you'll see the videos, and on the left, the student questionnaires in Chile. So observers' ratings of the same, of aligned scales or aligned teaching practices are much more clumped together, shown as these peaked distributions, so more mountainous. And on the left, you'll see that students are showing more variation, the flatter curves that you see there. And it turns out that this is another insight about how modes worked in this study. It'll be interesting to see if that holds over other studies. But there, in essence, in questionnaires, we see more classroom to classroom variation than we see when third-party observers are watching. Here's another look at the questionnaire. So you see that flatness, and another look at all the video scores. And you see, and maybe it strikes you, I can go back and forth, maybe it strikes you there's an awful lot more white space in those video scores than there are in the questionnaires. Okay, there's actually a problem with these with those videos. Take a look down at Japan and Shanghai. Look in classroom management, how those are super bunched. If you've watched any of those videos, you'll know that classrooms are exceptionally well managed, and there are very few disruptions there, but that amount of variation, it turns out, is problematic. You cannot have reliability without variation. So let's now take a look at the lesson materials. So these are the artifacts. And a reminder, these are scored on a 3-point scale, but we're only looking at 4 of the artifact scales that sort of map onto these other 2 scales. So again, class means, again, aggregated across lesson days, there were 4, and across raters, everything was double rated. So let's simplify one more time, take a look at Chile, and let's look again at the black dots. So we see that those means are varying. We see some variation there. We see that certainly in the case of connecting representations, the whole 3-point scale is being used. This is going to vary a little bit by country. You'll see more in a moment when I go to the full slide with all the countries. But we can see that explicit patterns and generalizations and asking for explanations are extremely bunched up down at the very lowest end, which means there were not explicit patterns or generalizations, and students were not asked to make explanations in general. This is now all of the countries, and generally the 4 focus scales showed variation in all countries. We see some distributions there, with perhaps the exception of the patterns and generalizations and asking for explanations. That's particularly problematic in Chile and Colombia, and to a lesser degree in Japan. Raters reported scores, though, that around connecting mathematical representations that really spanned the full spectrum and were quite variable. There is a lot to think about in these distributions, but I want to direct you to an important point about our foundational understanding of classroom interactions. And that is that mode can really shape our understanding of teaching quality. So let's say, as a case in point here, we're looking at disruptions. Again, we have student questionnaires and videos. We're looking at Chile. And if I was a researcher that only used questionnaires, I could reasonably come to the conclusion that there were a good number of disruptions, differences in disruptions across classrooms. But if I was using video, I wouldn't see very much difference in how classrooms were managed. Let's play that out to the implication for improving. So imagine that I'm also charged with doing professional development within a country. If I'm looking at questionnaire data, I might reasonably think, we could and we probably should offer some support for teachers learning about how to handle disruptions. But if I'm looking at video data, let's say created by my administrators, I might decide that's not really a good use of my time or my dollars in order to try to improve that. So these kinds of implications are important for us. And if we say this mode implication differently, we could say that the mode we use can actually lead us to different understandings. And it's those different understandings that then shape our knowledge of the field. I'll share with you one researchable hypothesis that gets generated from this looking across modes. So here we have questionnaires in the top panel, videos, and lesson materials. And if we go down here, we can see some very interesting things. So in the top panel, we see that students are reporting similarly in these three countries. Those patterns of distributions and the means look very similar. We see the same thing with videos, which are those third-party observers. But when we get down to the lesson materials, we notice that in the bottom panel, Mexico looks slightly different here. You can see that in connecting mathematical representations, the distribution is shifted more to the higher end than it is in the other two countries, and that's kind of curious. So we might ask ourselves, these lesson materials might ask ourselves, what is going on here? What do we make of these lesson materials? So we can think of the lesson materials in some ways as the intended curriculum, what the teacher's goals were. And we can think about the student questionnaires and the videos as sort of rough proxies for what actually occurred in the classroom. So for some reason, even though we have similar perceptions happening in Mexico, Mexico appears to have some curriculum materials that are connecting mathematical representations at a higher level than the other countries. So what might be causing this? A potential hypothesis is that teachers are not using those curriculum materials in Mexico in a way that students and those third-party observers are able to detect. So we can test this hypothesis by going back to the videos, going back to the lesson materials, and looking very carefully at how they're used. The lesson here is that when we use these multiple modes, we can generate wiser insights and hypotheses that we can then test about teaching and learning. So I'm going to stop us now. We're nearing the end from squinting at these distributions, but I would be remiss not to get to one point. I know many researchers want to know, do different modes predict valued outcomes differently? So let's at least get to that question. We're not going to be able to get to the bigger question, which is, do modes measure the same thing? But let's take the narrower question. So this is the question most people are really curious about. So do questionnaires, videos, and lesson materials sort of similarly predict the outcomes of interest? And here in this study, we were looking at student learning of quadratic equations, student interest in mathematics, and student mathematical self-efficacy. The latter two outcomes were measured by questionnaires. The top outcome was measured by multiple choice assessments. So the answer to this, in short, is no. They don't equally predict those outcomes. Now, there's a lot of interesting questions about why that might be, again, for another time. But on this side, what you see is the number of statistically significant relationships between the teaching practice or scale by mode. You see videos, the questionnaires, and the lesson materials, after we have controlled for student background variables and the pre-measure of the student outcomes. You'll notice, so only significant things are reported here, and we're counting numbers of significance, the number of scales or practices that were significant after those controls. You'll see there's some asterisks, and those were actually negative. So we could look back and say we thought those would be negative, and we can certainly try to explain why they're negative, but in general, we expected positive relationships here. So if we look at math learning, we see that none of our modes of measuring teaching quality predict students' math learning as measured in the post-test in more than 1 or 2 countries. Questionnaires predict students' report of their personal interest in mathematics and self-efficacy in all of the countries. We're looking at just 7 of the countries here for reasons I can answer later. Please note here, though, that questionnaires are predicting personal interest outcomes, and that's a mode-mode relationship, right? The same mode, so that's just worth noting. And videos and questionnaires predict students' questionnaire-based outcome, personal interest in math in 5 to 7 countries. All 3 modes predict math self-efficacy in half or more of the countries. So the key takeaways here is that questionnaires generally predict questionnaire outcomes, and most importantly, they predict personal interest and efficacy. We value both of those. And videos predict personal interest and to a lesser degree, self-efficacy across countries. And artifacts were more predictive of self-efficacy, with some relationships being negative. So if we look at the trade-offs, I won't read you this slide, but we're going to pull back now and look at the trade-offs as researchers we face when we want to choose. This is just a single study, so this is limited, but we know there's different levels of work it takes to implement these different types of modes. We saw different levels of variation. We know that we can't measure all aspects of teaching in the way we did with lesson materials, though of course there are exceptions. Hilda Borco and Felipe Martinez and Brian Stetcher have done lesson materials in a different way, which gets more content coverage. You saw the predictive relationships. And if we were to use these for feedback, these different modes offer different kinds of opportunities for us. Some have behavioral anchors, some do not. Some are very close to what the teacher might care about, students' perceptions, others are further afield. So, So there is an important point here about mode that I'll step away from, that we can take away from this TELUS video study. And that is, we have these modes that we have, right? We're familiar with them. But these modes, if we think back to that Venn diagram previously about the sort of real world daily teaching activities and those standardized observation activities, we know that the mode is going to also shape what it is we're able to detect of those real world practices. So I'd like to show you a new mode. And this is the one that Eckhart alluded to in his introduction, that has not been sold to states, but is now happily being used in research studies. And we've just finished a draft of a study that reports out on this. So what you're looking at here is a new mode for assessing teaching. And this is a virtual reality simulation study that we carried out with hundreds of teachers in the US to better understand what beginning teachers are able to do. We developed this particular way of looking at teaching and all of the associated materials that went with it. So we developed virtual reality tasks that kind of drop a novice teacher into a simulation. And in this case, you're looking at the leading group discussion simulation. So there's 5 avatars that have a simulation that we call a human in the loop simulation. So there is an interactor virtually somewhere else that animates using technology, those 5 avatars with very strict guidelines and a ton of training. So the teacher, the novice, can then interact around a particular task, discuss this text, right? This 4th grade text or something like that. And we, by standardizing the task itself, by standardizing the students, we are able to learn. Well, first, we're able to see in real time how a teacher interacts, and then we're able to give those recordings to raters so that they can rate it and provide us information about how novices compare to one another. So with this kind of technology, there's more overlap in the work the teacher, that we're able to see with our assessment tool, to the daily work of teaching. Now, of course, it's virtual, it's not real, they're not real students. I can say that the validity evidence here is promising. Of course, there are going to be trade-offs for this mode, and those trade-offs are going to have implications for the field's knowledge. But these innovations in mode, I would like to encourage us to think about, because they provide us affordances for different ways of understanding teaching. I hope it will be productive, but we will see. So in graduate school, a very brilliant sociologist, David Labrie, who just recently retired from Stanford, used to say to us when he was a faculty member at Michigan State, so what? So what, Courtney, why should we care about all of this, all of these trade-offs? Why should I, as a researcher, be really careful about thinking about my goals and then pay attention to how I define teaching quality and how I operationalize that definition with a particular assessment mode? So I don't know what your answer is to that question, but I can tell you what my answer is. So the reason why I care is that over the last almost 2 decades of research, I am convinced that the world is really ready for us to be the smartest, most collaborative versions of our researcher selves we can be with one another. That includes those policymakers. In fact, the world needs this from us. So the children in that picture on the left and all of the children, certainly in the United States and in Germany, need us to be that version of ourselves that can collectively impact both those books on the right-hand side, the books, but also those children on the left-hand side. I've watched too many videos, and day to day, many of these children are sitting in really mind-numbing, alienating instructional environments that don't help them develop their talents and don't help them envision sort of a better or more just society than the one that they were born into. And I know that as researchers, we can help. We can do studies that balance these trade-offs that we've been talking about this morning. We can be researchers writing those beautiful books in the library, but we can also be connected to the schools that we very much hope to impact. With that, I'll turn it over to the facilitators of our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Courtney, very, very, very much. Unfortunately, in this format, you won't hear the applause from the people watching on the other side of the channel. So I'll give it as an example. But thank you very much for this, I think, very rich and very reflective insight into your work. And I think you covered some questions that many of us who are working with, investigating teaching processes, investigating teaching quality, have often stumbled upon. So it's now time for everyone to ask questions. I know there is already one question in the chat, but I would like Eckhard Klima to have the first word and have start the discussion perhaps with your question.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for this broad and deep insight into your research and its foundations. I sometimes take a very traditional view of research, which is we as researchers are filling this library that was on your first slide. So we are writing books and papers, and these are filling libraries because we are looking for the truth on certain things that are called classroom teaching and learning. Obviously, this is too simple a view, but when you compared the Danielson framework with this framework that is more oriented towards special education, I wonder what makes for the difference between these two approaches. And this really understanding what makes them different may help us to understand whether there is something like a general theory and a general area of research on teaching. Is the difference the paradigm, the theoretical paradigm, constructivism versus information processing? Is it a normative difference? One is interested in student deeper thinking. One is interested in equity issues, dealing with students for needs. Is it a measurement difference? Is it about the field, whether you're talking about general education or special education? What makes for the differentiation that is so important?
Can it be all of it? No, in all seriousness, Eckhart. So this is actually right as a person who cares deeply about validity. I sometimes feel like, oh my goodness, all I ever see is purposes in the world and how tools align to purposes. So I should tell you that even calling something special education instruction assumes a particular student, and it assumes something about that child's mind. and it assumes something about the role of that child in the world and the role of public schools. I'll stick with the United States, So in this case, it's not just about differences. We can't actually pull those things apart to try to figure out what was the thing that caused this, because they all happen together at the same time. Now, you could say to me, all right, Courtney, let's develop a view of special education teaching that we then operationalize that cares about deeper thinking for special education students. And we could test that out. And certainly we can do that. I have no idea if that would get published or not. But what's interesting is that the humans who are most well suited to do that work have a particular paradigm that they are working inside of. And they, in general, hold that information processing perspective. They hold particular ideas about students. They are committed to equity. So these things are tangled up, I think, for us in the real world. Certainly as scientists, we can try to pull them apart and test A's and B's, you know what I mean? But whether or not somebody actually takes that up, I think, is a very important question. And one of the things that has come from that study is the question that you're asking said somewhat differently. So Nate Jones and Mary Brownell, who are both special educators, and I are interested in the next study, which asks the question, what is special about special education? And what is general about general education, which is the place that you started? And so one of the things we're going to do with that new simulation, I'm working with special educators here. We'd like to, because we can manipulate it with that new mode, we can manipulate the rubrics because we don't have to train that many people. We can manipulate the tasks. We can manipulate the students. And so in that simulation environment, we're going to try to get at this question. So this is an example where, for me, the mode, if you have an interdisciplinary team and you have a mode that has some affordances that are kind of fundable and you can do research that will ultimately get published, you have the opportunity to begin to sort out some of those questions.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from the chat, and it refers to the TALIS video data from Sebastian Rohl. Couldn't the high variance from the student perspective on classroom management also be due to the fact that students behave better because of the presence of the camera in the videotaped lessons?
It could be. We did ask that question, Eckhart. Maybe you want to talk about, Eckhart's team really did all of the questionnaire work, but we did ask that question. Eckhart, do you want to answer about what we learned from the questionnaires? We did ask students, did they change their behavior? Yeah. So in short, not very much. We don't see a lot of evidence of reactivity, to quote our colleague Anna Pretorius. We don't see a lot of evidence that here, but they, who knows? That could be social desirability bias. Maybe they're saying to us, oh, we didn't change how we acted. But I will say to you, if you were to watch some of those videos, they are pretty reasonably behaved. But it's an open question. We don't have evidence to suggest that's what was happening.
That's why I think it shows that this is also some trade-off of some disadvantage, that almost every method or mode that we use, when it comes that people produce some answers or some behavior or show material, it has always this element of people know they're being assessed. And so I think one thing that also is worthwhile is thinking about, can you find measures? I know it's ethically problematic, but if we want to have a true picture, it would have to be methods where people are not so aware of the assessment.
Sure, stealth methods, my colleagues call it, yes.
So Courtney, one question that's been guiding me throughout your whole talk is you started off with the observation that there is a gap between the research and the practice. And now when I think of what you told us, I think that this issue of assessment is really one reason for this gap, because I've also noticed this when I talk with teachers also, the way we try to assess in a psychometrically sound way, where we have high reliability, where we reduce complex constructs to something we can measure, is something that's our trade. That's what we have learned as people doing assessment, and we know that's what we need to get high quality assessment. Teachers, on the other hand, they only see this reduced version of their complex reality, and I've sometimes found that they seeing this reduced version they're not so ready to accept the findings we have with this version. And I think there's a gap that I'm not sure how this could be overcome. I think your virtual reality might be some point to try to have more complexity, but we know as soon as we have measurements that are more complex, they also lose a lot of their psychometric properties.
They surely do. One way we see people in the US doing this, and we are, from the birth of our country, we are decidedly interested in democracy, despite our recent and current struggles to the contrary. We are committed to democracy, and we see that in research happening all the time. One of the main movements in the field, I was just visiting the Carnegie Foundation and the W.T. Grant Foundation. I was on visits last week talking about the research center, and we were discussing what funders are interested in funding. And there is a major shift afoot here in the United States among private foundations. And I've sat on a number of our national review panels for IES and for NSF, and the same is happening there, which is to say, part of this racial equity awakening or reawakening that's occurring around the globe is to say we have to do some of these things together. So Eckhart, in contrast to our traditional, the ways we were trained, which is like the scientists do the scientific work, or we report back, or we develop, we are experts in how to develop these scales, and then we talk with teachers about them and try to help them understand, which Marika, you're getting at, is to say, no, you actually have to do it together. And two things happen when you do it together with practitioners. We have a group of studies here in the center that are doing this. All of a sudden, teachers start realizing like, oh, well, if we say the sentence that way, somebody could be thinking about this, or somebody could be. So very quickly, it's not that they become researchers, but they start to understand more the complexities, or why we would, in their view, essentialize down to some version of practice that we feel we can reasonably measure, right? And the reverse happens as well, where we say, yeah, this isn't probably getting at what we need, or we should really add a new scale about that. And so the funders here in the US are very interested in trying to fund work that's longer term, that's built on trusting relationships, because it has to be in order for those results to be valued by both communities. But it's hard work, and we're certainly not incentivized through our tenure structures to do that kind of work.
Yeah. Eckhart, do you have another question? There's not much happening in the chat at the moment. Otherwise, I have a question, because when you talked about modes and also about the different definitions of quality of teaching, I thought that that's not like you showed this difference between cognitive load reduction and, on the other hand, this constructivist, which is kind of like different positions within psychology. But as an interdisciplinary society, we all have different definitions of quality of teaching, or what to look at teaching, also across disciplines. And what are your thoughts or your experiences about getting these different disciplines together to work towards understandings of teaching, and then also the assessment?
The most productive thing, I mean, this is where I think places like the OECD and others who are trying, I think of PISA or PIAC, where they really do start with domain definitions, I do think helps. And Eckhart, I don't know what you thought about doing the Tallis video study, but one of the most profound experiences for me was listening to those 8 countries' economies define good teaching. And it was profound for 2 reasons. One, how many similarities there really were across wildly different cultures, right? From Shanghai and Japan all the way through Europe to England and Germany and Madrid, all the way to Mexico, Chile, etc. There were similarities, and that was fascinating, but there were some really big differences as well. And one thing that occurred in the development of those observation tools is, if you were to have said to me, Courtney, I'd like you to develop an observation system, I'll just say it right now, those would not, the systems we developed would not have been the systems I developed. So the systems that we developed are systems that reflect both what we could measure, and we were aiming, one of our goals was to get variation. We'd all done too many studies where there wasn't enough variation on these observation tools. So we were really trying to get variation. If it existed, we wanted to be able to capture it. And we wanted to have views of good teaching that everyone could agree to, that they could say, yes, that counts as good teaching in our culture. It's not everything, but it counts as some of what we care about as good teaching. And so it was that collaborative work where we defined the work people brought, instruments, etc. And an excellent job was done, I think, around the questionnaires. But that kind of process is the only way in my life as a professional in this space I've experienced solving that problem. You actually have to bring people to the table. Again, not quick, not easy, and not inexpensive.
If there's no other question,
Go ahead. Yes.
may I go on?
Mhm.
Okay. Just to comment on what Courtney just told us, one of the most impressive professional experiences I had over the last years was watching Courtney negotiating with representatives from these 8 countries to define video observation codes. That was really great and exceptionally difficult work. And in addition to being a teaching expert who knows teaching herself, plus being a very good researcher, you need to have a lot of cultural understanding and mediator capacity. My question, Courtney, is about the role of policy. And this was also something I learned in the Thales Video or Global Teaching Insights study. We had very little opportunity, and we still have very little opportunity to directly link to teachers, because the policy is in between. In that case, policy is the OECD and some national ministries. And quite often in educational research, the policy is standing somewhere in between research and practitioners. So what is your view on how can we succeed in getting into a productive dialogue between research and practice, which is not driven by policy interventions that so often keep us from doing what we believe to be best for practitioners? But maybe I'm too critical about a policy. Just would like to learn your view about it.
I've come to view policy as a hammer in search of nails. And everything looks like a nail to a policy, as it's blunt, and our world requires much more nuanced, detailed, differentiated solutions. So your question is an apt one. Are there ways to make those bridges? I showed on one of those slides this creation of research practice partnerships. That's a formal thing that we're funding here in the US. It was funded by the federal government with our new, I won't bore you with the details. Right now it's not federally funded and the foundations are funding it. But one of the ways that this gets done is through these research practice partnerships. So if people are interested in the funding models, often the sort of keeping the lights on and keeping some of the research assistants employed is what core funding gets paid for. That's often what they get foundation money or federal money for. And then we have one here in Madison. It's called the Madison Education Partnership. So with the Madison Municipal School District, I'm trying to think how many students are in MMSC. I'm not sure. There's 4 big comprehensive high schools, just to give you a sense of the scale. We have 2 lead researchers, one a sociologist, one an educational psychologist, and they're affiliated graduate students and support staff. And together, and there's an advisory board, and together over time, they define research questions. When I say together over time, I don't mean just with each other as researchers, I mean with the leads on the other side in the district. So right now, for example, they're working with the early childhood people in the district, and the district faces this puzzle, which the nation faces, which is how do we help students of color and low income students start school at a similar spot as our white children and our more financially advantaged children, because they begin this race of school very far behind. That's a problem that plagues the district, and it's a problem that plagues researchers. So that is of mutual interest, both to the district and to the people doing the work in the district, those 4K teachers, for example, those kindergarten teachers, and those researchers. And so they've designed a program of research that's on roughly its 3rd year. They can get external money because the district is staying focused on that. They've developed relationships with these 4K and these kindergarten teachers so they can get access to those classrooms. And now all of a sudden, now with much effort and again with time and money, they've built a way to work back and forth around mutual problems that can impact practice. So that's not the top-down version of how does research influence teachers, but it is, which I don't think, by the way, really very much works, just as an aside. So, but it is a way that it does work. Now, one last thing, my colleague, who's the Associate Dean for Research here, who I work with very closely, is she's a gerontologist, essentially. She's a cognitive scientist, but she works with elderly. And she works on issues of health equity. So I'm often lamenting to her all these problems in education. We can't get the schools to do what we want. We can't this, we can't understand that. It's all expensive. It's hard to collect data, la, la, la. And she's like, oh, it is the same way in healthcare. And I said, yeah, but some of our innovations, our most important findings never even get recognized for like 10 years. She's like, it's 7 in medicine, Courtney, 7. I'm like, 7? It takes you guys 7 years? You do all these double-blind clinical trials. It takes you 7 years to get your hospitals to do what you want. She's like, on a good set of findings, it takes 7. So I do think there's something to say about patience also.
I thought your example about trying to explain or trying to measure friendship shows that this problems we have in trying to assess good teaching or teaching quality is not specific to the field of education, but to every complex construct that in other fields as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're at the end of our talk. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Courtney, for your really impressive and also very thought-stimulating talk. I think many of us will have some food for thought for the next planning of your studies. And thank you also for staying along with us for the questions. Thank you, Eckhard Klima, for the introduction and the co-hosting of the session. And I'd also like to thank Patrick Rogotsky from the DIP for the technical support, and Katja Knut-Herzig, who was the chat host and helped us there. And so it's time for me now to close this specific keynote session, but also to close all our sessions in the DigiGaps, because this was officially the very last session of our virtual conference here. But we have one last, so it's not the very last, but when everyone who's interested, I would like to invite all the attendants of the conference to our DigiGap closing session, which will be on next Thursday, on the 16th of December at 5 o'clock, and it will be just like at the conference we would have a closing reception with some drinks and some well-meaning anecdotes and so forth. So it will be an informal event, and I hope many of you will join us there. And so that's time for us to close, and I wish you all a good last few days before Christmas, and hopefully we'll all get some good rest at the end of the year. Thank you very much.